If you sign that, you lose more than money. You lose the company. The words slipped out so calmly that for half a second, no one in the boardroom understood they were even real. The glass-walled conference room on the 42nd floor of Whitmore Capital was already under pressure, city skyline glowing outside, mahogany table reflecting the sharp, white ceiling lights, and a $3.2 billion acquisition contract sitting open in front of Richard Whitmore like a weapon waiting to be used. Richard didn't even look up at first. He just tapped his pen once against the table and said, "Pour the coffee. We're not here to listen to staff." A quiet ripple of restrained laughter moved across the executives, the kind people make when they want to agree with power without saying it out loud. Emily Carter stood near the end of the table holding a silver tray, her posture steady, her expression unreadable. She was 30, dressed in a simple black service uniform that made her almost invisible in a room full of tailored suits and luxury watches. No one was supposed to notice her. That was the rule. That was the expectation. But Emily wasn't looking at Richard. Her eyes were on the contract. Page 14 specifically. A faint crease formed between her brows as she studied the language buried deep in legal formatting, the kind of wording most people would skim past without a second thought. Richard finally glanced at her, annoyed by the silence. "Did I ask for commentary?" he said coldly, leaning back in his chair like the room belonged entirely to him. One of the board members cleared his throat, uncomfortable. Another shifted papers just to break eye contact. Emily didn't respond immediately. Instead, she carefully placed the coffee cups down one by one. The sound of porcelain touching glass felt louder than it should have in the silence that followed. Then she spoke. Not loudly, not aggressively, just clearly enough that every word landed exactly where it needed to. "If you sign that contract in its current form, you won't own Whitmore Capital in 24 hours. For a moment, nothing moved. Even the air seemed to hesitate. Then someone gave a short, uncertain laugh, thinking it was a joke. Another executive smirked slightly, assuming the maid had misunderstood something she wasn't qualified to read. Richard's expression tightened. "Excuse me." Emily finally lifted her gaze from the table to meet his eyes. No fear, no hesitation, just calm certainty that didn't belong in a room like this. She stepped slightly closer, not invading space, just closing distance enough to be heard without raising her voice. "Page 14, she said. "Liability transfer clause. Hidden override structure. It doesn't protect your acquisition, it reverses it. Every risk gets pushed back onto your company after signing. If anything triggers a compliance review, you absorb full exposure." The partner firm walks clean. The room shifted. One of the younger analysts leaned forward instinctively, eyes scanning the document faster now. Another executive stopped breathing for a second as he reread a paragraph he had ignored earlier. Richard frowned, finally looking down at the contract for the first time with real attention instead of assumption. "That's not possible," he said slowly. But his voice had already changed. Less certainty, more doubt. Emily didn't argue. She didn't need to. She simply stood there, hands relaxed at her sides, like she had nothing to prove and nothing to lose. That was what made the room uncomfortable. Not what she said, but how still she remained after saying it. Richard turned another page. Then another. The silence grew heavier with each second he read. The confidence in his posture began to erode in subtle ways, barely noticeable to anyone who didn't know what power looked like when it started to crack. One of the board members finally spoke, voice cautious. "Sir, she might be right. This structure, it's unusual." The word unusual hit harder than accusation. Richard didn't respond. He just kept reading, slower now, as if the contract had changed while no one was watching it. Emily stepped back slightly, returning her hands to the tray, as though nothing significant had happened. But before she turned away, she added one final line, soft enough that only those closest to her could hear it clearly. "I only said something because I assumed you wanted to keep your company." Then she looked toward the elevator doors, already opening behind her with a soft mechanical chime. The room remained completely silent as she began to walk out, every step measured, unhurried, unbothered. And as she crossed the threshold, Richard Whitmore, billionaire, decision-maker, the man who never hesitated, spoke again. But this time his voice wasn't commanding. It was uncertain, almost careful. "Wait, who are you?" The silence that followed her words did not end when she reached the elevator doors. It followed her like a weight that no one in the room was willing to drop. Behind her, Richard Whitmore remained seated, staring at the contract as if it had changed shape in his hands. The boardroom that had once felt controlled and predictable now carried a different kind of tension, one that no one wanted to name out loud. Emily Carter stepped into the elevator without looking back, her reflection briefly appearing in the polished metal doors before they closed. Inside the room, Richard finally exhaled, slow and controlled, but the uncertainty in his expression had already spread. One of the senior board members adjusted his tie and leaned forward slightly. "Sir, should we pause the signing?" he asked cautiously. Richard did not answer immediately. His eyes stayed on page 14, scanning the lines again and again, slower each time. The confidence that usually defined him in every negotiation was now replaced by something unfamiliar, a need to verify instead of declare. "Who is she?" he asked finally, more to himself than anyone else. The legal advisor sitting closest to him cleared his throat and opened a tablet. "Emily Carter, temporary staff assigned through Facilities Services. No executive access clearance. No formal legal training on record." Another executive frowned. Then how did she identify a clause like that? The question hung in the air without an answer. Richard closed the contract slowly, but did not let go of it. "Pull every version of this agreement," he said sharply. "Every draft, every revision, every email thread related to page 14. The tone had shifted back toward control, but something underneath it had cracked. Meanwhile, 2 floors below, Emily stepped out of the elevator into a quieter corridor. The noise of the boardroom vanished behind her, replaced by the soft hum of building ventilation and distant office activity. She walked with steady pace, not hurried, not hesitant, as if nothing unusual had happened. A cleaning supervisor glanced up as she passed. "Emily, everything all right upstairs?" he asked casually. She nodded once. "They are reviewing the contract." That was all she said before continuing down the hall. But inside the boardroom, everything had changed. Richard stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city skyline as if distance could help him think more clearly. Behind him, the legal team began breaking the contract apart line by line. Minutes passed, then nearly half an hour. The more they examined it, the quieter the room became. Finally, the senior legal advisor spoke again, voice lower than before. "It is real. The clause structure is intentionally buried within standard liability language. If executed as written, control over financial exposure would shift in a way that most executives would not notice during standard review." The words landed heavily. Richard turned slowly. "Explain it simply," he said. The advisor hesitated before responding. "It means what she said. The company would carry risks that appear after signing, while the counterparty remains protected through layered legal shielding." No one spoke after that. The realization settled in like a slow drop in temperature. Richard returned to his chair and placed both hands on the table. For the first time in years, he was not looking at opportunity or expansion or leverage. He was looking at a mistake that could have gone unnoticed under his authority. "Bring her back," he said suddenly. A few heads turned. "Sir?" one of the executives asked. Richard did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "Find her. Now." Down in the building's service corridor, Emily had just reached her locker when her supervisor approached with a confused expression. "You are being requested upstairs again," he said. She closed the locker slowly and turned. There was no surprise on her face, only understanding. As she walked back toward the elevator, the building felt different than it had an hour earlier. Not louder, not busier, but aware. When she stepped back into the boardroom, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The same executives who had barely acknowledged her presence earlier now watched her carefully, as if trying to understand what they had missed. Richard remained seated, but his posture was no longer relaxed. He gestured toward the chair at the far end of the table. "Sit," he said. Emily did not respond immediately. She simply walked forward and stopped at the edge of the table, not sitting yet, just observing. Richard studied her now with a different focus. Not as staff, not as background, but as someone whose presence had disrupted something he considered stable. "How did you see it?" he asked finally. Emily looked at him for a moment before answering. "Because I have seen similar structures before," she said calmly. "In a different context." That answer made several executives glance at each other. Richard leaned forward slightly. "What context?" A brief pause followed. Emily's expression did not change. "Before I worked here, I reviewed financial contracts for private compliance audits. Not at this scale, but the patterns are the same. The legal advisor looked up sharply. You worked in compliance? Emily nodded once. I did. Richard studied her carefully now, as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the room. Then why are you here as a temporary worker? He asked. Emily's answer was simple, but it shifted the room again. Because life does not always place people where their skills are used immediately. The silence that followed was different from before. It was no longer dismissive or skeptical. It was uncertain. Richard leaned back slightly, looking at the contract again, then back at her. For the first time since the meeting began, he did not have the next move ready. And that uncertainty, more than anything, filled the room completely. The tension in the boardroom did not fade after Emily Carter spoke her background. It only changed shape, becoming quieter, more focused, and far more dangerous in its uncertainty. Richard Whitmore remained seated at the head of the glass table, the contract now resting in front of him like an object he no longer fully trusted. Around him, executives no longer spoke freely. Even the smallest movement, a pen being placed down, a chair shifting slightly, seemed amplified in the silence. Emily stood where she had stopped, not sitting, not retreating, simply present. Richard studied her carefully, as if trying to map her presence against everything he believed about control, hierarchy, and predictability. Finally, he broke the silence. You said you reviewed financial contracts and compliance audits, he said. Emily nodded once. Yes. A senior board member leaned forward slightly. For what organization? Emily paused, not because she was uncertain, but because she was measuring how much detail was necessary. Independent consulting groups, she said. Some private, some government-affiliated. I worked mostly on risk exposure analysis and merger structures. The legal advisor at the table adjusted his glasses and looked at her more directly now. And you are currently employed as temporary facilities staff? He asked, unable to hide the disbelief in his tone. Emily responded calmly. That is correct. The contradiction hung in the air again, heavier this time. Richard leaned back slowly, his eyes narrowing not in anger, but in calculation. So you are telling me, he said, that someone with your background is currently serving coffee on a temporary assignment in my building? Emily met his gaze without hesitation. People's roles are not always aligned with their capabilities, she replied. No emotion, no defensiveness, just fact. A few of the executives exchanged glances. One of them lowered his voice. Sir, if what she is saying is accurate, then she may have more exposure to contract structures than our current review team anticipated. That statement shifted the energy again. Richard did not respond immediately. Instead, he reached for the contract and opened it again, flipping back to page 14. The room followed his movement silently. Emily's earlier warning now sat differently in the context of everything they had discovered. It was no longer just an interruption. It was a confirmation of something they had missed. Explain it again, Richard said finally, his tone lower now, controlled but no longer dismissive. Emily stepped slightly closer to the table, but still kept her distance. She pointed gently at the section in question without touching the document. The clause is structured in a layered liability transfer, she said. On the surface, it appears to distribute risk evenly between both parties after acquisition. However, there is embedded language in subsection C that reassigns post-execution liability triggers back to Whitmore Capital under specific regulatory conditions. One of the junior analysts frowned. What kind of conditions? Emily looked at him briefly before answering. Delayed compliance audits, external regulatory review, and third-party claim activation tied to transitional ownership periods. The analyst blinked, then looked down at the page again, reading faster now. Richard watched him, then looked back at Emily. And you are certain this was intentional? He asked. Emily did not hesitate. Clauses of this complexity are never accidental, she said. The word never landed sharply in the room. No one spoke for several seconds. Then the legal advisor leaned forward again, this time more urgently. If this interpretation is correct, we would need to suspend the signing immediately, he said. Richard did not react outwardly, but something in his expression tightened. He had built his reputation on reading deals faster than anyone in the room, on recognizing advantage before others even saw the shape of it. Now, for the first time in a long time, That confidence was under quiet revision. He stood up slowly and walked toward the window again, looking out over the city skyline below. The movement was deliberate, controlled, but no longer commanding. Behind him, the boardroom remained silent, waiting for a decision that had not yet formed. Emily remained where she was, hands relaxed at her sides, not pressing, not retreating. After nearly half a minute, Richard spoke without turning around. "If this is real," he said, "it means someone designed this. Agreement to survive standard review." The legal advisor nodded cautiously. "Yes, sir." Richard turned back slowly. His eyes were no longer focused on the contract alone, but on the structure around it, the team, the process, the assumption of safety that had been built into every step. "Then the question," he said quietly, "is not how we missed it." He paused. "It is how many other things like this are already inside our system." The room went still again, but this time it was not from shock. It was from realization. Emily finally moved, not toward the table, but slightly to the side, as if preparing to leave again unless she was needed. Richard noticed that movement and raised a hand slightly. "Stay," he said, not as an order, but as a request. And in that single word, the balance in the room shifted once more, from authority to uncertainty, from certainty to investigation, and from control to something far more unstable, the need to understand what they had never thought to question. The request for Emily Carter to remain in the boardroom did not feel like an order anymore. It felt like a pause in a system that had suddenly lost confidence in itself. Richard Whitmore stood near the window for a moment longer, watching the city below as if distance could help him regain control over the situation unfolding behind him. Then he turned back to the table. The contract remained open, page 14 still visible, like a silent accusation no one had yet resolved. Emily stood where she had been, composed, waiting without impatience. The executives around the table were no longer behaving like a unified group. Some leaned toward the document. Others leaned away from it, as if proximity alone might change the outcome. Richard finally spoke again, his voice steady but lower than before. "I want a full internal review," he said. "Not just of this contract, but of every active acquisition draft in the last 6 months." The legal advisor nodded immediately. "Understood, sir. We will prioritize high-value agreements first." Richard's eyes shifted briefly to Emily. "And I want her included in that review." That statement changed the room again. One of the executives blinked. "Sir, she is not part of the legal department." Richard did not look away. "She identified a structural flaw in a multi-billion-dollar agreement in under 5 minutes," he replied. "At this point, I am less concerned with titles and more concerned with accuracy." Emily remained still, but her expression changed slightly, not pride, not relief, but something closer to quiet resignation, as if this outcome was familiar in ways she did not need to explain. The legal advisor cleared his throat carefully. "We will need to formalize her access if she is to participate in document review." Richard nodded once. "Do it." There was no debate after that. The tone had shifted from authority to urgency. Emily finally spoke, her voice calm but deliberate. "I can assist in identifying structural inconsistencies, but I am not here to replace your legal team." Richard turned slightly toward her. "No one is asking you to replace anyone," he said. "I am asking you to explain what you see before we make decisions that cannot be undone." That distinction settled into the room with unusual weight. Emily looked at the contract again, then at the team around the table. "Then the first thing you need to understand," she said, "is that this clause was not designed to be found during standard review cycles." One of the analysts frowned. "Then how is it typically detected?" Emily answered without hesitation. "It usually is not. It is detected after execution, when liability triggers activate and ownership structures have already shifted." A quiet tension spread through the room again. Richard moved back toward the table and placed both hands on the surface. "How many agreements like this do you think exist in our portfolio?" he asked. Emily paused before responding. "That depends on how many were structured with similar layered liability frameworks." The legal advisor looked uncomfortable now. "We would need a full audit across all subsidiaries to determine that." Richard nodded slowly. "Started immediately." The board members exchanged glances but did not object. The authority in the room was no longer being exercised through confidence alone, but through necessity. Emily finally pulled. out a small notepad from the side of her uniform pocket. It was simple, worn, clearly personal. She opened it and wrote something down. Richard noticed. "What are you documenting?" he asked. Emily did not look up. "Patterns," she said. "If I am going to help you identify these structures, I need to track how they repeat across different agreements." That answer caused a subtle shift in the room again. It was no longer about a single contract. It was about a system. Richard watched her for a moment longer, then spoke quietly. "You were right about one thing earlier," he said. Emily looked up. "Which part?" "That life does not always place people where their skills are used immediately," he said. The room went still again, but this time differently. It was not tension. It was recognition. Emily closed her notebook gently. "Then we are simply correcting timing," she said. Richard allowed a faint pause before responding. "Or correcting oversight," he said. A faint realization passed across several faces at the table. The conversation was no longer about whether Emily was qualified to be in the room. It was about how many rooms like this had functioned without ever noticing someone like her. The legal advisor broke the silence carefully. "Sir, if we proceed with a full audit, it will require suspension of multiple active negotiations." Richard did not hesitate. "Then suspend them." That single response shifted the atmosphere completely. What had begun as a standard acquisition meeting was now evolving into something far larger, something internal, something structural. Emily looked at Richard again, and for the first time, there was a slight change in her tone. "Most companies do not pause for this level of review unless they are forced to," she said. Richard met her gaze. "Then consider this the first time we are choosing to do it before being forced." The room fell into a deeper silence, not of uncertainty anymore, but of acknowledgement that something foundational had shifted. Outside the glass walls, the city continued moving at its usual pace, unaware that inside this room, the rules of decision-making had just been rewritten. Emily closed her notebook and stepped slightly back from the table again, as if preparing to return to her original position. But Richard spoke before she could leave the center of attention. "Stay involved in this process," he said, not as a command this time, but as an acknowledgement that the next phase of what they were dealing with could not proceed without her perspective. And for the first time since the meeting began, no one questioned why. The boardroom did not return to normal after Emily Carter was asked to stay involved in the audit process. Instead, it felt like a system had been switched from automatic confidence into manual control. Every decision now required confirmation. Every assumption now required verification. Richard Whitmore remained at the head of the table, but his focus had shifted entirely from the contract in front of him to the structure behind it. Emily stood slightly to the side of the main table now, no longer positioned as staff, but not yet integrated into the formal legal team either. It was an in-between space that reflected exactly where the organization itself now stood. The legal advisor had already begun organizing a rapid response audit team, pulling in senior analysts from multiple departments. Documents were being projected onto the glass wall screen one after another, showing contract structures, liability flows, and acquisition pathways from the past several months. The room was no longer discussing a single deal. It was now reviewing an entire pattern. Richard watched silently as Emily stepped closer to the screen, her attention narrowing as each document appeared. She did not rush. She did not react dramatically. Instead, she studied each structure with a focus that made the analysts in the room begin to adjust their own pace, as if unconsciously trying to match her level of observation. One of the senior analysts finally spoke. "We have identified 3 additional contracts with similar structural language," he said. "All of them involve deferred liability activation clauses tied to regulatory transition periods." Richard turned slightly. "Which departments approved them?" The analyst hesitated. They were routed through different review teams, but the approval signatures indicate consistent oversight clearance at mid-level authorization. Emily stepped forward slightly. "That pattern is intentional," she said calmly. All eyes shifted toward her again. She continued without pause. "When approval responsibility is distributed across multiple departments, accountability becomes fragmented. That makes structural anomalies harder to detect during isolated review." The legal advisor nodded slowly. "So it is not a single failure point," he said. "It is a distributed design." Emily confirmed with a simple nod. "Yes." Richard leaned forward, resting his hands on the table again. His expression had changed from curiosity to something more serious now. "How deep does this go?" he asked. Emily looked at the projected documents for a moment before responding. "Deep enough that isolated review will not be sufficient," she said. "You need a full structural mapping of all active agreements, not just legal compliance, but logical dependency tracing between clauses." One of the executives frowned. That level of analysis would normally take weeks. Emily responded immediately. "Not if the system is already categorized properly." That statement caused a brief silence. Richard turned toward her fully now. "Explain," he said. Emily walked closer to the table, placing her hand lightly near one of the printed reports without touching it. "If contract structures are indexed by clause dependency rather than department ownership, you can identify repeated design patterns across agreements in hours instead of weeks," she said. The legal advisor looked at her with growing attention. "That requires a level of system familiarity most external consultants would not have," he said. Emily did not react to the implication. "It requires recognizing that contracts behave like interconnected frameworks rather than isolated documents," she replied. Richard studied her for a long moment. The room remained completely quiet now except for the faint sound of data loading on the display wall. Finally, he spoke. "Do it," he said to the legal advisor. "Rebuild the review process the way she described." The advisor hesitated only briefly, before nodding. "Yes, sir." As the team began reorganizing the audit structure in real time, Emily stepped back again, returning to her position near the edge of the room. But Richard did not allow the distance to remain. "Emily," he said. She looked up. "You said earlier that life does not always place people where their skills are used immediately," he continued. She nodded once. Richard's voice lowered slightly, not softer, but more deliberate. "If I move you into this review team officially, it will not be temporary access anymore." Emily understood immediately what he meant. This was no longer observation. It was integration into a core decision process of the company. The weight of that shift was not lost on anyone in the room. She did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked at the data on the screen again, then at the team already restructuring around her input. Finally, she spoke. "Then I will need full transparency access to all acquisition pipelines," she said. "Not partial summaries." The legal advisor looked at Richard. Richard did not hesitate. "Granted," he said. That single decision changed the atmosphere of the room again. Emily was no longer standing outside the structure she had identified. She was now inside it. As the meeting continued, documents streamed across the display faster, teams adjusted workflows, and communication channels were reorganized in real time. But Richard remained focused on something else. Every so often, his eyes returned to Emily, not with suspicion anymore, but with a growing awareness that what had entered his boardroom was not just an anomaly in a contract. It was a level of insight that forced the entire system to reconsider how it had been operating without question. And for the first time since the acquisition meeting began, the real decision was no longer about one deal. It was about who had been overlooked all along. The restructuring of the audit system did not bring silence back to the boardroom. Instead, it replaced silence with controlled motion. Screens continued updating in real time, documents streamed across the glass wall display, and teams moved between analysis layers as if the entire company had shifted into a higher level of awareness. Emily Carter remained within the room, now officially integrated into the review process, her access confirmed, her role no longer temporary, but still not fully defined by any traditional job structure. She did not sit at the head of the table, and she did not need to. Her presence alone was already changing how information was interpreted. Richard Whitmore observed this quietly from his position near the center of the room. He was no longer directing every action, but instead watching how others responded to input they would previously have ignored. The legal advisor approached the main display again, pulling up a new cluster of contracts flagged by the system Emily had suggested. "We have identified additional correlation patterns," he said. "These agreements share structural dependencies that were not visible under department-based review systems." Richard stepped closer to the screen. "How many?" he asked. The advisor hesitated briefly. "At least 9 active agreements and 4 in final negotiation stages." A low murmur moved through the executives in the room. The scale of the discovery was no longer theoretical. It was operational. Emily studied the screen carefully. Her expression remained composed, but her focus had sharpened further. She moved slightly closer, pointing without touching the display. "These are not isolated designs," she said. "They follow a staged implementation model." One of the analysts looked up. "What does that mean in practical terms?" Emily responded without delay. "It means the structure evolves across multiple agreements. Each contract is designed to appear independent, but together they form a progressive transfer system." The room went quiet again, but this time it was not uncertainty. It was recognition of complexity they had not previously considered. Richard crossed his arms slowly. "A progressive transfer system of what exactly?" he asked. Emily looked at him directly. "Control exposure," she said. "Not immediate ownership transfer, but gradual shift of liability and decision authority through layered contractual activation points." The legal advisor exhaled slowly. "That would require coordination across multiple drafting teams," he said. Emily nodded once. "Or a standardized template being reused without full understanding of its long-term interaction effects." Richard turned slightly toward the legal team. "Can we trace the origin of the template?" he asked. The advisor shook his head. "Not yet. It appears to have been modified incrementally over time and distributed across multiple internal channels." Emily stepped back slightly, her attention shifting from the screen to the flow of the conversation itself. "That is typical of systems designed to avoid centralized detection," she said. Richard studied her again, more carefully now. "You are describing this as if you have seen it before," he said. Emily paused briefly. "I have seen variations of it," she replied. "In systems where oversight is divided and accountability is assumed rather than verified." The room absorbed that statement without interruption. Richard walked a few steps away from the table, thinking. The scale of what they were uncovering was no longer just about contracts. It was about structure, design philosophy, and how easily complexity could be hidden inside systems built on trust between departments. He finally turned back. "If we continue this audit," he said, "what is the risk exposure timeline?" The legal advisor checked the data on his tablet. "If any of these agreements reach activation conditions simultaneously, the financial exposure could escalate within a 30 to 60-day window, depending on regulatory triggers." A silence followed that was heavier than before. Richard looked at Emily again. "And you identified this in a single document earlier today," he said. Emily responded calmly. "I identified the pattern. The documents confirmed it." That distinction mattered. It was no longer about spotting an error. It was about recognizing a system. Richard nodded slowly, then made a decision. "We are halting all pending acquisitions until this audit is complete." Several executives reacted immediately. "Sir, that will affect quarterly projections," one of them said. Richard raised a hand slightly, stopping further objections. "We will adjust projections later," he said. "We will not proceed blind." The room fell into a controlled silence again, this time accepting the direction rather than resisting it. Emily remained still, watching the shift in priorities take hold across the team. Richard walked back toward the table and placed both hands on its surface again. "From this point forward," he said, "all contract approvals require structural review validation." He looked toward Emily. "And you will lead that validation process." The statement landed differently than anything before it. Not as delegation, but as alignment of responsibility. Emily did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked at the scale of what was now in front of her. Multiple systems, multiple agreements, and an organization suddenly aware of its own blind spots. Finally, she spoke. "Then we will need to rebuild the review framework entirely," she said. Richard nodded once. "Start immediately." As the team began reconfiguring workflows again, Emily turned slightly toward the screen, already analyzing the next layer of data. The room no longer felt like it was reacting to a disruption. It felt like it was entering a correction phase. And for Richard Whitmore, standing in the center of it, the realization had fully formed that the most significant shift in his company was not the discovery of hidden contract structures, but the emergence of someone who could see them before they became consequences. The boardroom had entered a new phase that no longer felt like reaction or discovery, but sustained transformation. The audit system, once a static legal procedure, now functioned like a living map of interconnected agreements, constantly updating as new patterns emerged across multiple departments and timelines. Emily Carter stood at the center of this evolving structure without physically occupying the central seat, yet every analytical flow now passed through her interpretation before reaching final validation. Richard Whitmore remained present throughout the process, no longer issuing constant directives, but observing how decisions formed through structured reasoning rather than assumption. The legal advisor coordinated the expanded review team, who now worked across 3 separate floors, feeding contract data into a unified system Emily had helped design in real time. The atmosphere was no longer tense in the way it had been during the initial confrontation. It was focused, controlled, and driven by urgency, grounded in measurable risk rather than uncertainty alone. Emily reviewed the latest cluster of flagged agreements projected on the main display wall. Her attention moved methodically across each document, identifying structural similarities that were not obvious at first glance, but became clear when viewed as part of a larger system. One of the senior analysts approached cautiously. "We have expanded the dataset to include legacy agreements from the past 18 months, he said. Emily nodded without turning away from the screen. "Include them in the same structural index," she replied. The analyst hesitated. "That will significantly increase processing load." Emily responded calmly. "Then prioritize by dependency risk instead of chronological order." The adjustment was made immediately. Richard watched this exchange quietly from behind her position. What stood out to him was not just her technical accuracy, but the absence of hesitation in how she processed complexity. Every instruction she gave was precise, measured, and rooted in systems thinking rather than reaction. After a moment, he spoke. "You are restructuring our entire audit methodology in real time," he said. Emily turned slightly toward him. "I am aligning it with how the contracts actually interact," she replied. Richard studied her for a brief moment. "And how long would it have taken your previous teams to see this level of structure?" Emily paused before answering. "If working under standard departmental review, likely months. If unnoticed entirely, never." The weight of that statement settled across the room. The legal advisor, standing near the secondary console, adjusted the data feed and spoke cautiously. "We have identified an external pattern correlation," he said. "Several of these agreements appear to reference an originating framework that is not internally generated." Richard immediately turned. "Explain." The advisor hesitated. "The base structure resembles external consulting templates used in cross-border acquisition advisory firms." Emily stepped closer to the display again, her focus narrowing. "Which firms?" she asked. The advisor listed 2 names. One of them caused a brief shift in Emily's expression, subtle but noticeable. Richard observed this change immediately. "You recognize it," he said. Emily did not deny it. "I have encountered similar structural frameworks in prior consulting environments," she replied carefully. Richard's tone remained controlled. "Are you saying this design originated outside this company?" Emily answered with precision. "I am saying it likely originated externally and was adapted internally without full structural review at each iteration." The room fell into another layer of silence, deeper than before, because the implication was no longer about oversight alone, but about dependency on external design systems embedded within internal operations. Richard walked slowly toward the screen and looked at the expanding map of contract dependencies. "If that is true," he said, "then we are not dealing with isolated risk exposure." He paused. "We are dealing with a framework that has been integrated into our decision infrastructure." Emily nodded once. "That is correct." One of the executives finally spoke, voice lower than before. "If the framework is embedded across multiple divisions, removing it will require a complete restructuring of our contract lifecycle process." Richard did not respond immediately. He was now fully aware that the issue had expanded beyond any single acquisition or audit cycle. It had become a structural dependency embedded within the organization's operational logic. He turned back toward Emily. "How do we remove something that is already integrated into active systems without disrupting ongoing operations?" he asked. Emily considered the question carefully. "You do not remove it immediately," she said. "You isolate it. Then you reconstruct parallel validation paths before phased extraction." The legal advisor nodded slowly. "That would require continuous monitoring across all active agreements during transition." Emily confirmed. "Yes." Richard looked at her for a long moment. The initial question that had brought her into the boardroom no longer mattered. The structure of her involvement had already evolved far beyond that moment. Finally, he spoke. "You are not temporary staff anymore," he said. Emily did not react emotionally. She simply waited for clarification. Richard continued. "Effective immediately, you will lead the Structural Integrity Division for all acquisition and compliance frameworks." A few executives exchanged glances, but none challenged the decision. Emily paused for a moment before responding. "That level of responsibility requires full authority over contract approval pipelines," she said. Richard nodded. "You will have it." The room absorbed the finality of that exchange. What had begun as a single-clause identification had now resulted in a complete restructuring of authority within one of the company's most critical operational systems. Emily turned back toward the display wall, already transitioning her focus to the next phase of analysis. Behind her, Richard Whitmore remained still for a moment longer, recognizing that the decision he had just made was not simply about operational efficiency or risk correction. It was about acknowledging that the most important structural insight his company had ever received had come from someone who was never originally part of the system designed to see it. The Structural Integrity Division had now become the operational center of Whitmore Capital's internal review system, and with Emily Carter officially placed at the head of that framework, the entire company began functioning under a different rhythm of accountability. What had once been fragmented oversight across multiple departments was now being unified into a single continuous analysis flow. Screens across the executive floor displayed real-time contract mapping, dependency chains, and risk propagation models that updated with every new data input. Emily stood at the central interface station, not elevated physically above others, but positioned where every major decision path intersected. Richard Whitmore remained present in the space. Throughout the transition, observing rather than directing, allowing the system to operate under its new structure while evaluating its effectiveness. The legal advisory team, now expanded with additional external compliance specialists, worked in coordinated cycles, feeding structured data into Emily's review layer before final approval routing. The atmosphere inside the executive floor had changed from reactive urgency to controlled precision. Each decision now required validation through structural mapping, and every agreement had to pass through dependency verification before proceeding to execution. During a mid-cycle review, a newly flagged correlation appeared on the main system display. One of the senior analysts immediately escalated it. "We are seeing a cross-division dependency trigger," he said. "This connects 3 separate acquisition agreements with overlapping liability activation points." Emily approached the screen and reviewed the data silently for several seconds. Her focus narrowed as she traced the connection pathways across multiple contract layers. "This is a cascading structure," she said finally. "Each agreement is not independent. They are sequential triggers within a unified activation model." The room fell quiet as the implication became clear. The legal advisor stepped forward. "Are you suggesting these agreements are designed to activate in sequence rather than isolation?" Emily nodded. "Yes, that is why they were not detected during individual review cycles." Richard Whitmore, who had been standing near the edge of the room, stepped forward slowly. "In what scenario would that sequence activate?" he asked. Emily turned slightly toward him. "Regulatory pressure events combined with ownership transition thresholds," she said. "If 3 or more agreements reach trigger conditions within the same evaluation window, the liability structure escalates across the entire network." A silence followed that was no longer uncertain, but analytical in nature. The team was no longer reacting emotionally. They were processing scale. One of the executives spoke carefully. "That would imply coordinated design across multiple contracts over time." Emily responded without hesitation. "That is the only explanation consistent with the structural pattern." Richard folded his arms slowly. "And this went undetected because each agreement appeared valid on its own." Emily confirmed. "Yes, the structure relies on compartmentalization of review responsibility." The legal advisor exhaled slowly. "We have been evaluating risk at the document level," he said, "not at the system interaction level." Emily looked at him. "That is the gap," she said. The room absorbed the correction without resistance. At this stage, disagreement was no longer productive. Only refinement mattered. Richard returned his attention to the main display. Can we neutralize the sequence? He asked. Emily considered the system map carefully before responding. Not immediately, she said. You cannot deactivate what is already structurally embedded without first isolating its dependency paths. One of the analysts frowned. So what is the first step? Emily answered clearly. We create a parallel validation structure that intercepts activation conditions before execution occurs. The legal advisor nodded. A shadow review layer. Emily confirmed. Yes, that will allow us to intercept triggers without disrupting existing operations. Richard studied her for a moment. How long to implement? He asked. Emily replied after a brief calculation. 72 hours for initial deployment. Full integration within 2 weeks if no external interference occurs. Richard turned toward the legal team. Begin immediately, he said. There was no hesitation in the response. The system had already reached a point where delay was no longer an option. As the teams dispersed into execution mode, Emily remained at the central station, reviewing the live data feed as new dependencies were flagged and mapped in real time. Richard approached her quietly. You are effectively redesigning how this company evaluates every financial commitment it makes, he said. Emily did not look away from the screen. I am ensuring that evaluation reflects actual system behavior, she replied. Richard paused before speaking again. Most people in your position would focus on individual corrections, he said. Emily turned slightly toward him. Individual corrections do not prevent systemic failure, she said. The simplicity of that statement carried more weight than any technical report currently displayed in the room. Richard nodded slowly, then looked at the expanding structural map across the display wall. When this is complete, he said, the company will not function the same way it did before. Emily responded calmly. That is the intended outcome of structural correction. The room remained in motion around them, teams continuing to implement the new validation architecture, systems updating, dependencies recalibrating. But at the center of it, a shift had already taken place that could not be reversed. The company was no longer operating under assumptions built from isolated review. It was now being reconstructed under the principle that every decision existed as part of a larger system. And in that system, the presence of someone who could see those connections before they became consequences had already changed the direction of everything that followed. The structural reconstruction of Whitmore Capital had reached a point where the company no longer resembled its previous operational identity. What had begun as a reactive audit response had evolved into a fully integrated decision architecture, with Emily Carter positioned at the core of every validation pathway. Across multiple floors of the executive headquarters, teams now operated under a synchronized review model that treated every financial agreement as part of a connected system rather than isolated documentation. The real-time dependency map on the central display had become the primary reference point for all executive decisions. Richard Whitmore stood at the center of the executive floor, observing the final phase of system stabilization. His presence was no longer that of a directive authority issuing commands, but of a stakeholder witnessing the restructuring of the very framework that once defined his control. Emily remained at the main interface station, reviewing the final integration of the shadow validation layer that had been deployed across all active contract pipelines. The system now intercepted structural dependencies before they reached execution thresholds, ensuring that no agreement could proceed without multi-layer validation approval. A senior systems analyst approached Richard with a final status update. The shadow validation layer is now active across all active acquisition channels, he said. We are currently processing 97% of existing agreements through the new dependency verification protocol. Richard nodded slowly. And anomaly detection? He asked. The analyst responded immediately. All previously flagged structural risks have been either neutralized or isolated pending further review. A brief silence followed. It was not uncertainty anymore. It was confirmation that the system was functioning as intended. Richard turned his attention toward Emily. You have effectively changed how this company operates at its core level, he said. Emily did not react with emotion. She simply acknowledged the statement with a calm nod. I have aligned the system with its actual complexity, she replied. One of the executive board members stepped forward cautiously. What happens when this level of transparency is applied across all future acquisitions? He asked. Emily turned slightly toward him. Then you no longer evaluate risk after agreements are formed, she said. You evaluate risk as part of the formation process itself. The implication of that statement settled across the room. It was no longer about fixing errors. It was about redefining how decisions were made before they became structural commitments. Richard looked at the expanded dependency map across the display wall. Multiple contract systems were now visually connected through layered pathways, revealing interactions that had previously been invisible under traditional review structures. We are no longer operating in a linear acquisition model, he said quietly. Emily responded without turning away from the data. Correct. You are operating within a networked liability ecosystem. The legal advisor, standing near the secondary console, added cautiously. Which means future growth must be evaluated in terms of system impact rather than isolated valuation. Emily confirmed. Yes, scale is no longer independent of structure. Richard exhaled slowly, absorbing the full implication of what had been established. The company he had built had not been broken. It had simply been operating without awareness of its own internal complexity. And now that complexity was fully visible. After a moment, he spoke again. What you have built here is not just a review system, he said. Emily finally looked at him directly. It is not new, she replied. It is simply aligned with how the system already behaves. That distinction changed the tone of the room one final time. It was not innovation. It was correction. The executive floor remained active, but the urgency had shifted into sustained precision. Every team now worked within the same unified structure, every decision passing through the dependency verification framework before reaching approval. Richard stepped slightly closer to Emily. You understand that what you have implemented will affect every future decision this company makes, he said. Emily nodded. That is the purpose. A long pause followed. Richard looked at the structural map once more, now fully stabilized across the display system. Then the company is no longer defined by individual decisions, he said. Emily responded calmly. It is defined by system awareness. The silence that followed was no longer uncertainty, nor tension, nor analysis. It was final comprehension. The organization had transitioned